The chalk dust of challenge. It was a sweltering afternoon in Chennai, the kind where the air hangs heavy with the scent of exhaust and ambition, where time slows down under the oppressive weight of the Indian summer. The city buzzed with life, its buses heaving with passengers, the sidewalks thronged with vendors, students, and families going about their lives. Tucked in one of the quieter corners of this ever-awake city was the grand campus of the Indian Institute of Technology Madras, its red brick buildings standing like sentinels of tradition and excellence. Within those walls, young minds wrestled with equations, theories, and the pressure of legacy. For Sundar Pichai, a quiet, unassuming first-year student from a modest family, the environment was both electrifying and intimidating. He had always been drawn to numbers, their predictability, the way they bent but never broke under logic. But here, in these hallowed halls, everyone was brilliant. Everyone was someone. And for once in his life, Sundar wasn't sure if he truly belonged. Unlike many of his classmates, he hadn't come from a family of scholars or scientists. His father, an electrical engineer for the British conglomerate GEC, worked tirelessly to provide the best for his family. Theirs was a small two-room apartment in Ashok Nagar, a far cry from the air-conditioned villas some of his peers called home. Yet, his father's passion for learning and his mother's warmth and insistence on humility were the quiet forces that had shaped him. His childhood had been simple, evenings spent discussing current affairs with his father, reading library books under the faint glow of a street lamp, or marveling at the technical manuals his father brought home. His world was small, but rich in thought. Sundar had always been sharp, gifted with an uncanny memory and a remarkable affinity for logic. He could remember every phone number he ever dialed, a quirk that amused friends but hinted at something more profound. Yet despite this gift, Sundar was soft-spoken, rarely the loudest in a room or the first to volunteer. He was the kind of student who preferred listening to speaking, thinking to reacting. It was in the lecture hall of Professor Raghav Sharma, the department's most feared calculus instructor, that Sundar's quiet strength would face its first major test. Professor Sharma was an institution unto himself, brilliant, accomplished, but notoriously harsh. He was a man of precision, one who expected not only academic excellence, but complete submission to the rigor of mathematical logic. Rumor had it that he had once failed half his class, simply because they didn't format their problem sets according to his standards. His lectures were a mix of awe-inspiring clarity and ruthless interrogation. Many students, even the best, found themselves shrinking under his intense gaze. It was the third week of the semester when Sundar had his first real encounter with the professor. That day, the classroom was packed, the air buzzing with apprehension. On the blackboard, a terrifyingly complex set of integrals had been scrawled in white chalk. The sun filtered in through the high windows, casting a golden glow on the neatly aligned desks, where some students were already sweating before the lecture even began. Professor Sharma entered the room in his usual fashion. Brisk, no nonsense, with a leather folder under one arm and a perpetual scowl that seemed carved into his features. Without a greeting, he turned to the board, scanned the room, and pointed his chalk like a general commanding a charge. "You," he said, locking eyes with Sundar, "solve the third problem." There was a moment of stunned silence. Sundar blinked, unsure if he heard correctly. He had been sitting quietly in the fourth row, taking notes, blending into the academic tapestry like any other focused student. This abrupt spotlight made his heart skip. He stood slowly, walking toward the front with a nervous energy. Murmurs flitted through the room like static. Some students watched with sympathy, others with anticipation. Sharma was known to use public embarrassment as a pedagogical tool, and many feared this might be another one of those lessons. Sundar picked up the chalk with steady but cold fingers. He stared at the problem, a twisted integral with a parameterized function embedded within a limit. Not easy, not textbook, definitely not first-year standard. "I'm waiting," Professor Sharma said, arms folded. Sundar's eyes darted across the board. He inhaled, blocking out the room, letting the math become his only reality. He began working through the problem silently, almost meditatively. His process wasn't hurried, nor was it hesitant. He drew diagrams, rearranged the terms, factored the constants, applied the theorems. Line after line appeared like a quiet symphony unfolding from chalk. The whispers stopped. Even Sharma was quiet, his eyes narrowing as he studied the solution. After 10 long minutes, Sundar stepped back. "I believe that's the correct reduction," he said softly, the final expression dangling at the bottom corner of the board. Sharma stepped forward. He stared at the board, not once but twice. Then again. The room waited for the inevitable lashing, but it never came. Instead, Sharma turned, facing the class with an expression that was nearly unreadable, perhaps the slightest crack of surprise, perhaps irritation. "You got lucky," he muttered. "Sit down." Sundar did as told, quietly returning to his seat, but the damage, or rather, the impact, had already been done. For the rest of the semester, the aura around him began to shift. Whispers followed him down the corridors. People wanted to know who the quiet boy was who had solved Professor Sharma's trap question in front of 100 people without flinching. Some were impressed. Others, threatened. But Sundar didn't gloat. He continued attending classes, kept his head down, and worked harder than ever. He knew that talent was only the beginning. What truly mattered was discipline, resilience, and an unshakable love for learning. He didn't want to prove anyone wrong. He just wanted to prove himself right. Sharma, however, had not forgotten the encounter. Though he never praised Sundar publicly, he began to test him in subtler ways. Questions directed to him were more complex, his assignments more grueling. Yet Sundar never complained. And week by week, the two began to develop an unspoken respect. It was not friendship, nor mentorship. It was a recognition of intellect, sharp, stubborn, and undeniable. One day after class, Sharma approached him for the first time outside lecture. "You don't speak much," he said. "I speak when it matters," Sundar replied with a respectful smile. Sharma mused. "Your brain is good, but your world is small. You need to think beyond the limits of this campus. You ever considered going abroad?" Sundar was surprised. "I don't know. My family. We're not wealthy. I'll likely take a job after this." Sharma studied him for a long second. "Brains like yours should never be caged by circumstance. Think bigger, Mr. Pichai. Mathematics will take you wherever you dare to go." Those words stayed with Sundar long after the conversation ended. They echoed in his mind during lonely nights of studying. During the mornings, he left home before sunrise to catch the bus, and during the silent meals in the mess hall where everyone talked about companies and careers, he began to see beyond the narrow confines of his original plan. He started applying for research internships, reaching out to professors across the world, challenging himself with graduate-level problems. And slowly, opportunities began to open. Years later, that same Sundar, the boy who once stood nervously in front of a blackboard, fearing public failure, would walk confidently onto the stages of the world, helming one of the most powerful technology companies in human history. But the world would never know that it all began in a classroom where a chalkboard challenge, a harsh professor, and a moment of quiet courage changed the trajectory of a life. For greatness often starts not with grand pronouncements or loud victories, but with the stillness of belief, the power of perseverance, and the silent brilliance of a mind that refuses to be underestimated. The seasons shifted over Chennai, as months flowed like currents beneath the surface of campus life. The heavy monsoon rains came and went, washing the city in waves of muddy water and moments of introspection. The sun returned, brighter and more relentless than before, and with it came the thick fog of academic stress. For most students at IIT Madras, life was a cycle of lectures, labs, and late-night problem sets, an unspoken agreement between ambition and exhaustion. But for Sundar Pichai, the rhythm had begun to change. Something deeper stirred within him. something that had less to do with equations and more to do with meaning. The subtle recognition from Professor Sharma had planted a seed in Sundar's heart, not of pride, but of possibility. Until then, he had thought of his education as a ladder, one rung at a time, a steady climb toward a secure job, a stable income, maybe a better life for his parents. That had been the dream. But now, the ladder seemed to stretch infinitely upward, vanishing into a sky he hadn't dared to look at before. The professor's words kept returning like a quiet whisper. Brains like yours should never be caged by circumstance. That single idea turned into a silent obsession. Each night, as his classmates played chess or debated politics over chai in the common room, Sundar stayed behind in the computer lab. He spent hours there, not just coding or solving problem sets, but reading papers, exploring software, teaching himself programming languages, and dabbling in digital logic and design. He became fascinated by the way machines processed information, how elegant strings of code could solve problems that once took teams of analysts days. While his peers obsessed over grades, Sundar began to crave knowledge that transcended the classroom. It was during one of these late nights that he discovered an archived paper from Stanford University, an intricate exploration of algorithmic efficiency in data management, the depth of thought, the clarity of logic, the beauty of the ideas. It shook him. It was like stumbling into a new world, one where intellect was boundless, where the problems weren't just exercises, but real-world puzzles waiting for solutions. That night, something clicked inside him. He knew then that he didn't just want to be good at math or engineering. He wanted to contribute to something greater, to be at the frontier of innovation, to solve problems that would change the way people lived. But the road ahead was anything but easy. While his academic brilliance began to shine brighter, it also came with its shadows. Some students, once friendly, grew distant, even hostile. Jealousy is often an invisible poison in high-pressure environments, and Sundar's quiet competence began to stir resentment. In group projects, he was either excluded or assigned the hardest parts. Whispers followed him in corridors. Teacher's pet, overachiever, village genius. Yet he said nothing. He absorbed it like heat on an asphalt road, never reacting, only learning. The pain of exclusion only sharpened his resolve. He reminded himself that storms always accompany rising tides. Then came the scholarship applications, the true gauntlet between Sundar's dream and the world beyond. With his sights set on graduate study abroad, particularly in the United States, he knew the competition would be ferocious. There were forms to fill, essays to write, recommendations to secure. But more than that, there were doubts to conquer. Every time he stared at the blank page on his computer screen, he felt the weight of inadequacy creep in. Who are you to think you belong at Stanford? At MIT? Do you even know what those places are like? Those weren't voices from others. They were his own. Doubt, after all, is often the last enemy to fall. One day, after a long lab session, he sat under a neem tree on campus, clutching the draft of his personal statement in his hands. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear of failure, but from the enormity of what he was attempting. He had written about growing up in Ashok, about watching his father fix circuit boards late into the night, about the excitement of hearing his first dial tone when the family finally installed the landline. He had written about how numbers weren't just tools to him. They were companions, silent, steady, and endlessly fascinating. But he wasn't sure if it was enough. Could a story like his, humble, local, ordinary, ever hold weight in the halls of global academia? Professor Sharma found him there by accident. He had been walking across campus when he noticed Sundar sitting alone with a look of deep contemplation, a rarity for the boy who usually worked with quiet but constant motion. "You look like someone solving a paradox," Sharma said, not unkindly. Sundar looked up, startled. "I don't know if I should submit this," he said, handing over the paper. The professor read in silence. A few students walked past, chatting and laughing. Somewhere in the distance, a cuckoo sang, a melodic reminder that life, in all its complexities, still flowed on. After a few minutes, Sharma handed the essay back. "You speak of your past like it's something to hide," he said. "But your story is your power, Sundar. It's not the labs or the grades or the math. It's the humility, the hunger. That's what makes you special." "But what if they don't see it that way?" Sundar asked. "Then they're not the right place for you, but someone will. The world isn't blind, just slow to recognize brilliance when it doesn't come wearing a suit." With renewed confidence, Sundar submitted his applications. Weeks turned into months. He threw himself into his studies while the responses slowly trickled in. Rejections came first, cold, standard emails that made his heart sink for a few seconds. But then, one day, it happened. He received an email from Stanford's graduate program in materials science and engineering. He had been accepted. At first, he couldn't believe it. He read the letter over and over, heart pounding. The email was formal, almost clinical in tone, but to him, it was a symphony. It meant the dream was real. The door had opened. He was about to step into a world he had only ever read about in books, where the brightest minds gathered, where problems weren't just solved, they were redefined. His parents cried when he told them, not out of sadness, but out of pride and perhaps a touch of fear. Their son would go halfway across the world to a land they had never seen, to a future they couldn't even fully imagine. But they believed in him, always had. As Sundar prepared to leave, Professor Sharma called him to his office one last time. "You won't find me sentimental," Sharma began. "But I must say, watching you grow has been one of the rare reminders that teaching still matters." Sundar bowed slightly. "Thank you, sir, for everything." Sharma handed him a small book, Euclid's Elements, bound in faded leather. "My father gave me this when I went to university. Now, I give it to you. Not because you need to learn more math, but because you must remember that logic is not cold. It is not cruel. It is clarity. And in the world you're about to enter, clarity will be your greatest ally." Sundar left Chennai not with fanfare, but with quiet determination. As the plane lifted into the clouds, he looked out the window at the city below. The same streets he had walked as a child. The crowded buses, the schoolyards, the tea stalls. Everything felt so small now. Yet in that smallness was the beginning of something infinite. He had come from a place where dreams were whispered. Now he was headed to a place where they were shouted from rooftops. And though he did not yet know what awaited him in California, what trials, triumphs, and transformations, he knew this. He was ready. For the math that mattered most wasn't on paper. It was within him. A calculus of courage, a geometry of grit, an algebra of hope. And he would solve it, one equation at a time. The first thing that struck Sundar Pichai about California wasn't the air, the vastness of the Stanford campus, or the strangely polite drivers. It was the silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of independence, of dorm rooms without the chatter of family, streets without familiar vendors shouting orders, libraries without the constant hum of rustling pages and fans overhead. He arrived in Palo Alto on a crisp September morning, the sky an unreal shade of blue, the air lacking the weight and scent of monsoon rains, and yet everything felt curiously distant. He had traveled nearly 8,000 miles to chase a dream, but the first thing he felt was loneliness. Stanford was a place unlike any other he had known. The buildings were a mix of Mediterranean elegance and modern architecture. The lawns were impossibly green, and the students moved through campus with an air of confident purpose. They carried laptops like second skins and spoke in acronyms he had yet to decipher. APIs, SD keys, VC funding, IPOs. It wasn't just a university. It was a preview of the future, where technology met ambition and innovation was not just encouraged but expected. For the first few weeks, Sundar struggled, not with the coursework, but with the culture. While his peers debated startup strategies over dinner or discussed their latest app prototype during lectures, He found himself quietly catching up on nuances he hadn't been exposed to before. His understanding of material science was solid, his mathematics sharp, but the world here demanded more than knowledge. It demanded adaptability, speed, vision, and above all, confidence in one's own ideas, no matter how radical. The nights were the hardest. In his tiny dorm room, surrounded by foreign textbooks and the hum of late-night keyboards down the hall, he would think of his parents, of Chennai, of the small balcony where he once stood dreaming of faraway places. Now he was here, and yet the path forward felt uncertain. He wasn't the loudest voice in class. He didn't have a polished accent or a portfolio full of internships. But what he did have was a mind trained for discipline and a heart tempered by humility. He knew how to learn. And more importantly, he knew how to endure. Soon, Sundar began to find his rhythm. He focused not on trying to imitate others, but on refining what made him different. He spent long hours in the lab, not just fulfilling assignments, but designing small experiments, exploring the intersections of material science with computational logic. He started attending lectures outside his department: computer science, user interface design, even psychology. He became fascinated by human behavior, by the subtle ways in which people interacted with machines. The idea that technology wasn't just circuits and code, but an extension of the human experience, captivated him. It was during one of these interdisciplinary seminars that he heard the term user experience in depth for the first time. A professor had discussed how the future of technology would not be determined solely by power or speed, but by empathy, by how well a system understood and served the user. That moment was a revelation. Sundar began to see technology not as a fortress of logic, but as a bridge of understanding, a medium through which humanity could express itself, evolve, and connect. Around this time, Sundar met Rajiv Mehta, a postdoc from Delhi working on a user interface project involving real-time adaptive software. Rajiv was charismatic, outspoken, and deeply intuitive. Where Sundar was measured, Rajiv was mercurial. Yet they complemented each other. The two began collaborating on side projects, tinkering with open-source platforms, building simple tools that translated user behavior into predictive design changes. They didn't realize it then, but they were building skills and perspectives that would soon define the next era of technology. Sundar's academic performance remained impeccable, but it was in these passion projects that his true growth occurred. He had started thinking beyond the problem sets. He was starting to think about people. Yet success didn't come without cost. The pressure of balancing research, coursework, part-time jobs, and cultural adaptation took a toll. Sundar often skipped meals, running on caffeine and resolve. He missed birthdays back home, festivals with his family, even his sister's wedding. Phone calls were rare and brief. His parents couldn't afford frequent long-distance charges, and internet calls were still an unreliable luxury. Each sacrifice carved a small scar, but he wore them like medals, knowing they were proof of his journey. Then came a moment that would subtly redirect his trajectory. One evening, while attending a tech symposium hosted by Stanford's Graduate School of Business, Sundar stumbled into a talk being delivered by a guest speaker from a small but growing company in Mountain View. The speaker was discussing the future of search, how information would become the most valuable currency of the 21st century, and how the real challenge wouldn't be access to data, but organizing it in ways that were meaningful to the average user. The company, still young and ambitious, was called Google. The simplicity of their mission struck Sundar like lightning: to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. It wasn't just a technical challenge, it was a philosophical one. And it resonated deeply with his growing belief that technology, at its best, was an enabler of human potential. From that moment, Sundar became quietly obsessed with the idea of joining Google. Not for the perks or the prestige. It was still a startup then, barely known beyond tech circles, but because he felt aligned with its purpose. He admired its clarity, its audacity, and its user-centric vision. He began following every update about the company, analyzing its products, especially a new project they had launched, the Google Toolbar. It was a small tool that integrated into browsers, allowing users to search without opening a separate page. Simple, efficient, elegant. Sundar saw something others didn't. While most dismissed it as a minor feature, he understood its potential to revolutionize user interaction. He began to sketch ideas, ways the toolbar could adapt to individual behavior, could preload common queries, could evolve into something more than a shortcut. In his mind, the toolbar wasn't just a tool. It was a doorway. By the time he completed his graduate studies, Sundar had two offers on the table, one from a well-established tech firm with excellent pay, and one from Google, less money, more uncertainty, but a mission that set his soul on fire. His choice, as always, wasn't guided by fear or vanity. It was guided by curiosity. He chose Google. When he arrived at the campus, a modest set of buildings near a strip mall, it didn't feel like a place that would change the world. But within those plain walls were minds that burned with vision, and Sundar felt, for the first time since arriving in America, that he had found people who thought like him. Not in terms of status or showmanship, but in terms of solutions, of elegance, of empathy and design. He joined as a product manager, initially working on the toolbar he had admired so much. His approach was quiet, methodical, and thoughtful. He didn't rush to dominate meetings or push his ideas. Instead, he listened. He observed, and when he spoke, people leaned in. He proposed subtle but powerful changes to the toolbar: predictive search queries, better integration with the browser environment, user customizable settings. Every enhancement was rooted in one question: what does the user truly need? Not what is flashy or what is profitable, but what is helpful. Within a year, the toolbar's usage grew dramatically. Internally, Sundar's name began to circulate, not as a disruptor, but as a designer of clarity, a craftsman of experience. And then came a moment that would change everything. One morning, a heated debate broke out during a meeting at Google's headquarters. The company was discussing whether to develop its own browser or continue relying on third-party platforms like Internet Explorer. Opinions were split. The risks were high. The development cost was enormous. The future uncertain. Sundar, who had been quietly working on an internal concept for a new kind of browser, fast, secure, minimal, decided it was time to speak. He presented his vision. It was simple, elegant, focused. A browser built not for engineers, but for users. One that prioritized speed, security, and simplicity. One that respected attention spans and minimized distractions. The room fell silent. His idea became a project. The project became a revolution. That browser would be called Google Chrome. And Sundar Pichai, the soft-spoken boy from Ashoknagar, who once stood trembling before a chalkboard in Chennai, would soon lead it. The launch of Google Chrome was nothing short of a watershed moment in the history of Internet browsers. It wasn't just a new tool, it was a statement. A declaration that Google was not merely a curator of information, but a builder of the future's digital highways. When Chrome went public in 2008, it entered a space long dominated by entrenched giants like Microsoft's Internet Explorer and Mozilla Firefox. Yet, within just a few years, it would surpass them all to become the most used browser in the world. And at the center of that transformation was the quiet, analytical brilliance of Sundar Pichai. But what the world witnessed as a seamless and clean interface was the result of years of turbulent development, internal debates, and relentless refinement. Within Google, the journey toward Chrome's success was anything but smooth. There were skeptics who questioned the need for a browser when the company already had significant traffic coming from existing ones. Engineers were divided between those who saw Sundar's vision and those loyal to older systems. Even Larry Page and Sergey Brin, Google's co-founders, took convincing. Yet, Sundar stood firm, not with arrogance, but with the calm conviction of someone who had seen the end result before others dared to dream it. He believed that the future of computing would not be tied to desktop software but to the browser. That the browser would evolve from a simple information tool to a full-fledged operating environment. He believed in lightweight architecture, in sandboxing processes to enhance security, in speed without sacrificing functionality. And most of all, he believed that users didn't want clutter. They wanted clarity. He had no slogan for it, no flashy pitch, just pure, unwavering logic backed by data, design, and a deep understanding of human behavior. His leadership style during Chrome's development was unlike anything Silicon Valley was used to. In a world that often rewarded loud personalities and aggressive posturing, Sundar was a study in grace under pressure. He didn't yell to assert dominance or rush decisions to prove decisiveness. Instead, he asked questions, probing, thoughtful questions that forced people to think deeper. He welcomed dissent, not as confrontation, but as a crucible for better ideas. If someone disagreed with his approach, he didn't dismiss them. He invited them in, asked them to collaborate, to co-create. Slowly, even the skeptics began to notice, not just his intelligence, but his integrity. It was around this time that Sundar was offered leadership over an even broader range of products. Google Toolbar, Google Gears, and eventually, Google Drive. But he knew that true leadership wasn't about expanding authority. It was about deepening impact. He continued to spend long hours refining Chrome, reviewing lines of code, ensuring the browser's performance stayed true to its promise. He was the rare executive who still read bug reports at 2 a.m., who still replied to user feedback personally. His work ethic wasn't driven by perfectionism, but by a quiet sense of responsibility. He had built something people depended on. That meant everything. Outside of work, Sundar's life had changed dramatically as well. No longer the graduate student scouring cafeteria job boards for part-time shifts. He now had a steady income, a growing reputation, and a young family to care for. He had married Anjali, his college sweetheart from India, someone who had believed in his potential long before it was realized. Their relationship had weathered years of distance, uncertainty, and sacrifice. And now, in the quiet moments at home, while helping his children with homework or cooking a simple meal together, Sundar found the grounding he needed to navigate the chaos of a fast-moving company. But success never travels alone. It brings with it newer, more sophisticated challenges. As Chrome's adoption exploded, Sundar found himself drawn into the vortex of internal politics. Within any rapidly growing organization, especially one like Google, which thrived on creative chaos, there are inevitable clashes of vision, personality, and power. As his influence grew, so did the attention. Some saw him as the future of Google. Others saw him as a threat to their own ambitions. Strategic decisions were suddenly met with more scrutiny. Rumors circulated. Allies became cautious. Friends became competitors. There was a particularly tense period when Google began considering entering the hardware market more aggressively. Android, the mobile operating system Google had acquired, was gaining traction globally. Sundar, who by then had been given oversight over Chrome OS, believed there was a future in integrating both platforms. A seamless experience across devices, browser, laptop, mobile, could offer users an ecosystem that was powerful yet simple, but not everyone agreed. The Android team had its own philosophies, its own leadership. Meetings were tense. Decisions became battlegrounds. It was during one of these high-stakes internal conflicts that Sundar displayed what many would later call his defining trait as a leader: empathy without compromise. Rather than turning disagreements into personal vendettas, he redirected the focus to data, to user needs, to the shared mission of the company. He often reminded his team, "We don't win by beating each other. We win by building something people love." Slowly, even his fiercest critics came to respect him, not just for his intelligence, but for his ability to navigate complexity with humility. He didn't have to win every argument. He only needed the best idea to win. His leadership was rooted in clarity, collaboration, and consistency, and the results spoke for themselves. Chrome's user base crossed the 100 million mark within just a couple of years. It wasn't just a browser anymore. It was a gateway. An entire operating system, Chrome OS, was spun off it. Chromebooks began entering classrooms, offices, and households. The simplicity of the interface, the speed of startup, the lack of virus vulnerabilities, all hallmarks of Sundar's design philosophy, began to influence industry standards. And yet, Sundar never made himself the center of attention. While others chased headlines and keynote speeches, he preferred the quiet satisfaction of impact. He remained at heart the same boy from Ashoknagar, curious, diligent, and humble. Then, in 2014, everything changed. Larry Page and Sergey Brin, the iconic co-founders of Google, announced a major internal reorganization. As they stepped back from day-to-day operations to focus on their broader holding company, Alphabet, they needed someone to lead Google, someone who understood the products, the culture, and the vision. Someone who wasn't just a brilliant engineer or a savvy executive, but someone who embodied the values they had built the company on. They chose Sundar Pichai. The announcement stunned many in the industry. Some cheered, others questioned. But those who had worked alongside him, who had seen his evolution from a product manager to the architect of Google's core technologies, knew this was no accident. It was earned. In his first all-hands meeting as CEO, Sundar didn't deliver a fiery speech. He didn't list out bold strategies or dramatic declarations. Instead, he told a story about his childhood, about the phone his family waited years to install, about how that single device opened his mind to the power of information. He reminded everyone that technology, at its best, is about possibility, about people, about bridging worlds. Under his leadership, Google would go on to expand its ventures into AI, quantum computing, healthcare, education, and sustainability. Products like Google Assistant, Google Lens, and TensorFlow carried his fingerprint, a relentless pursuit of simplicity wrapped in sophistication. But perhaps his most profound impact was cultural. He championed diversity in hiring, emphasized ethical AI development, and insisted on transparency in product design. He encouraged a culture where engineers didn't just write code but understood responsibility. He often told young employees, "You don't need to shout to be heard. You need to solve problems that matter." Years later, as Sundar walked the global stage, speaking at UN forums, meeting with heads of state, representing one of the most powerful companies in the world, he did so not with the swagger of a tech titan, but with the grace of someone who remembered every step of the journey. Every lonely night in a dorm room, every silent sacrifice, every unsolved problem that once kept him awake. For him, success wasn't a destination. It was a process, a lifelong equation of values, vision, and perseverance. He had never chased fame. He had chased meaning. And somewhere along the way, he had rewritten what leadership in the 21st century looked like, not with noise, but with nuance. Not with ego, but with empathy. Leadership, when observed from the outside, often looks like triumph. Clean stages, thunderous applause, quotes in the media, and handshakes with presidents and prime ministers. But the truth of leadership, especially the kind that Sundar Pichai now carried on his shoulders as the CEO of Google and Alphabet, was far from glamorous. It was invisible weight, silent burdens, decisions that could shape the course of nations and futures, made behind closed doors, under relentless scrutiny. And in the age of technology, where power could shift with a line of code, that weight had grown heavier than ever before. When Sundar assumed full leadership over Google and its parent company, the world was at a pivotal junction. Artificial intelligence was no longer science fiction. It was transforming lives, systems, and societies. Privacy was being redefined as the data of billions moved through invisible digital channels. Political unrest across nations often had its roots in what users saw or didn't see on platforms Google powered. Algorithms were not merely showing search results. They were shaping perspectives, elections, even truths. To be at the helm of such power required not just intelligence, but a rare form of moral clarity. Sundar, who once spent his nights refining browser logic and optimizing user tools, now had to think like a philosopher, a diplomat, a guardian. He had to face governments who accused Google of monopolistic practices, regulators who demanded transparency, activists who warned of digital colonialism, and users who asked whether their voices were still their own or echoes shaped by unseen filters. And through it all, he had to lead engineers, product teams, researchers, creatives, and thousands of others across the globe, each with their own idea of what Google should be. The first major storm under his leadership arrived in the form of a congressional hearing in Washington, D.C. Sundar, dressed in his signature understated suit, stood before rows of U.S. lawmakers, answering hard, often accusatory questions about data collection, political bias, and corporate influence. The room was tense, the cameras relentless, the questions sharp and occasionally performative. But Sundar remained composed, not cold, but composed. He didn't dodge. He explained, not in jargon, but in language anyone could understand. He refused to play the game of spectacle. Instead, he reminded the world that the business of information was not just a commercial pursuit, it was a sacred trust. In interviews after the hearing, reporters asked if he had been afraid. Sundar only smiled slightly and said, "I wasn't afraid. I was aware of the responsibility. And I've learned that responsibility often speaks quietly, but it listens very, very carefully." That attitude became his compass. Inside Google, Sundar championed a culture of thoughtful innovation. He encouraged teams to think beyond speed and scalability, and instead focus on ethical impact. When AI breakthroughs began to show promise of exceeding human capacity in certain domains, he did not rush to commercialize them. Instead, he formed internal review boards, invited ethicists to the table, and slowed down what many others might have rushed forward. His philosophy was simple. Just because we can, doesn't mean we should. That restraint, though, wasn't always popular. Some investors viewed his caution as hesitation. Some employees viewed his diplomacy as lack of boldness. But Sundar didn't flinch. He believed deeply that long-term trust was more valuable than short-term profit. He believed that Google had not become a part of daily human life simply because it was efficient, but because it was reliable. And reliability, in this new era, required integrity, not just innovation. Even so, challenges mounted. In 2020, a global pandemic swept across the planet, upending every assumption about life, work, and human connection. Entire economies stalled. Schools closed. Hospitals overflowed. The digital world became, for many, the only world still moving. Google's platforms, from search and YouTube to Google Meet and Android, became lifelines for billions. And suddenly, the question wasn't just about product functionality, but survival. Could Google support remote learning for students in rural Africa? Could it prevent the spread of misinformation in real time? Could it provide resources for frontline workers while protecting user data under mounting pressure?